Hey, you're listening to another Debugging Dan podcast. I'm Dan. I'm taking you along on my morning walk, spinning IDs, thinking out loud. This episode, I want to talk about IDEs. So I've been around for a while. I've used a lot of different IDEs, but up until a few years ago, the biggest players were Visual Studio by Microsoft, mostly for .NET development. JetBrains has a big set of IDEs, all tailored to different programming languages. For the last few years, there's Visual Studio Code, but I've noticed that with AI and agentic development coming on, there are a lot of new players coming up, and most of them, which I find interesting, are forks of Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a code editor by Microsoft, and it's built around the Monaco open source editor component, and it's built using web technology on Electron. So that makes it easier to ship for different operating systems. There are even versions of Visual Studio Code that run in your browser, like when you use github.dev, you get a Visual Studio Code version inside your browser. And a lot of agentic tools are forking Visual Studio Code and running them themselves. So there's Cursor, which is a fork, Kilo, Windsurf, Anti-Gravity by Google. So they all kind of work the same, but also different. They're kind of diverging. I work a lot with Cursor, and Cursor is getting a lot different than Visual Studio Code is. And I think that's an interesting ecosystem. I'm not really sure that it's a good thing, because most of the forks of Visual Studio Code, they support the same plugins, but some plugins are then proprietary, are uniquely linked to Visual Studio Code. Microsoft in a license doesn't allow them to be used by other projects. Like there were some issues with the WSL layer for Windows, the .NET plugin, I believe. So they are kind of building a moat, but not with Visual Studio Code, but some of the plugins. So that also leaves the ones building a Visual Studio Code fork scrambling to fix those plugins. And there are also plugins that stop working when you update them. They're not maintained by Microsoft, but for example, Prettier version 12 broke recently on Cursor because of they didn't fully support ESM, I believe, in their plugin stack yet, while Visual Studio Code did, and it broke. So there's a lot of copying and similarity to those projects. And what I like is one of the newcomers called ZED, the Z editor, which is being built by one of the original creators of Atom, which was, I'm not sure if it's a precursor to Visual Studio Code, but that was one. Atom was built, I believe, by GitHub, and that's the editor that kind of created Electron. So they built Electron to be able to build Atom, the editor, as a desktop app. One of those creators, or multiple, I'm not sure, they started building Z. So Z has been built from the ground up. It's his own thing, and it's built using native code. So there are no web technologies there. They have their own plugin structure. And of course, the downside there is that they need to build their entire ecosystem of plugins and things like that. I can't support all the existing Visual Studio Code plugins because they work really different. They do support Linux, Mac, and Windows now also since a few months. And what I really like, in my opinion, in contrast to the ones that are forking Visual Studio Code, well, mostly doing to be able to build their agentic IDE the way they like it is that they really have a vision on development. So it's built from the ground up, and I believe that they started before AI and agentic development really became popular. They did add it, but their vision is to have a lot of collaborative support. And I'm not sure it's there yet. You can download it now for free, but they're working on a team version that gives you a pay plan where you can very easily connect to your colleagues or co-workers or other people and discuss code and implementation inside your editor. So it's possible to give feedback, to do pair programming, remote, those kind of things. That's one of the pillars that they're working on for that. And I recently read one of their blog posts, and what they're also thinking about or working on is capturing context. So what it means is when you're using a Git, for example, and you create a pull request to review, you only see the end result. You see the way the code was before the feature was started. And after a while, you see the result, and you don't see what went in between the pull request. What they're trying to do, what they want to do, is to build some kind of additional context layer that captures all other information. So if you had a call, it should store a transcript, or it should store meeting notes, action points. When you did pair programming, it should be stored. When you use AI, you prompt, you use agentic editing. That should all be captured inside version control. And I'm not sure how they plan to do this, but I think it's really cool because you really learn more about the code. And of course, it could get a lot to process. If besides the changes in the code, you also need to process that. But the plan is also to use your AI to read that context and to give in more information when doing things. So compared to all those Visual Studio Code forks that are popping up, I really think that Z is a very refreshing, very new thing, even though it's been around for a couple of years. But it's interesting, to say the least. And going back to those Visual Studio Code forks, I think, well, there is a lot to choose from. And I guess it's up to you what kind of flavor you'd like and things you'd prefer. So I prefer not using Visual Studio Code with Copilot, but I prefer using Cursor. It's also a benefit or a subscription I receive at my workplace. But I like the models. They built their own Composer 1 model. In the past, I preferred their tab completion model, which was pretty powerful. Like most people, kind of moved beyond tab completion, writing less code and doing more via the agent. And I think, of course, every Visual Studio Code fork has their own benefit and their own interesting points. And I think it also depends on the project how big the difference is between the Visual Studio Code and the original and the fork. So the Cursor, they have a history to update with a new version like every 1 or 2 days. So you keep updating. So they move really fast. They also did make some changes to the interface to make it more agents first. I haven't used Copilot a lot, but I was in it last week, and there I also saw interface changes. But I see that Visual Studio and Cursor are really drifting apart in that sense, while other agentic IDEs might not do that so much because they have a smaller team, for example. They don't really have a benefit really differentiating, because then also the load for maintaining sync with the original version is more bit bigger. And there are also teams or companies that took a different route. They just take Visual Studio Code and they build a plugin for it. For example, Cloud Code, they have a very powerful CLI. They don't have their own IDE, but they just, at least they still do, they offer a plugin for Visual Studio Code that allows you to control Cloud Code visually if you're not really a fan of the CLI. So I think that's interesting. And there are different routes to doing the same thing, but for me, Zed really jumps out there, really stands out, because they're really trying to do things different with a vision that goes beyond agentic AI, code editing. And it could be that it turns out that in a couple of years, their vision seems outdated because the way that we program is really changing and shifting, and that it really doesn't matter anymore. For example, that we store so much context, so that we have discussions about code because it's mostly agents writing it. But now, at the moment, they are building their IDE, they have a vision. They're also building new protocols or standards. They build ACP, I believe. It's an agent coding protocol, or it's not coding, I think they see, but it's something similar. And that's a protocol that they defined to describe how agentic models or agentic extensions can communicate with the editor. So they abstract away that you're directly linking in with Zed, use that protocol as a go-between, and it's up to the agent provider to build a between layer between their, for example, CLI and that ACP protocol, and then it can just be used by Zed and any other IDE that is also implementing the protocol. And JetBrains has also started supporting the same protocol. So if you build an integration with ACP, your agentic model or agentic agent harness, your agent harness, can be integrated with both Zed and JetBrains. So they're also really building new things that do not only benefit Zed, but they also benefit the entire ecosystem. And I think that's really powerful. That's it for today. I'd like to end with suggesting give Zed a try. They're really cool. Their editor is really still a work in progress. They only recently added full Git support, but it's really a breath of fresh air compared to all the Visual Studio Code editors out there. They're free to download, and they also have a free tier that gives you a couple of dollars to try out doing agentic coding with AI models within Zed. So that also gives you an idea on how that works within Zed and how that will boost your workflow. That's it for this one. Leave a comment on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, like, subscribe. You can follow me on Blue Sky, debookingden.com, and hear you on the next, or see you, or you hear me on the next one. Bye.